Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I want to talk about the phonograph at home. You know, today, it's a very, very different world. Today, we have various types of entertainment systems. We have remarkable mass communication. We have television. We have computers. We have digital recording. We have whatever. There's so many different avenues of entertainment. And it's so hard today, as I record this in December of 2016, to understand the world of 130 or 120 years ago. If we go back 120 years, it is 1896. In 1896, it was a very, very different world. There was no mass communication. The closest thing we had to that would be the telephone, which was somewhat rudimentary at that time, and we had the telegraph. We also had newspapers, and there was a form of mass communication, but it was very slow and to a degree somewhat impersonal. The phonograph in 1896 had really not advanced very far. It was a rich man's toy, more or less, and it had been from its inception. But by the time of the mid-1890s, there were big changes starting to take place. There were companies producing cheaper machines. And eventually, very much in a sense, if you think about it, like in the 1940s and early 1950s, someone in the town or on the block would get one, just like in the 1940s and 50s with the television. And suddenly, everybody on the street had to come over and take a look at it. And perhaps a couple of stores in a city or a town would have one, and people would come by just to listen to it. And so it was this wonderful new device that kind of shocked people. And as time went on, and time changed, and mass production took place with sound recording, machines started working their way around the world. So by the time of about 1900, it wasn't as rare a device as it had been, although it was still not something you would see in every home. Because face it, if you were paying $25 for a machine, which you have to understand how much $25 was. This was not a small amount of money. You could buy a house for $1,000. So if you think how much $25 were. Well, let's put it this way. $25. If the average salary in 1900 was about $5 a week, that was well over a month's salary. Let's just put that in today's money. Think about that. Think of 4 weeks of your salary plus another week of the following month, and then you could get a machine that would play records. This was not a small purchase. This was very, very expensive. Another thing that's important about understanding the phonograph at home. Let's go with the year 1900. In the year 1900, there were many people who were still very much alive at the age of 80, and they were, in the United States, they were veterans of the Mexican-American War. You had the last survivors of the War of 1812 dying. You had millions of Civil War veterans. You had lots of people who were very aware of the world and the United States from the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Now, the younger generations, of course, born after the Civil War, were more often the ones who were buying these new devices. So when the records came out, the records would play for the generations that they expected to listen to. There would be a tremendous amount of songs that were popular during the American Civil War. There were songs of old America. There were songs of old Europe. There were songs of little consequence with us and our understandings today. But you have to understand that the earliest records were playing for the generations that were alive. John Brown's Body was wonderful to hear. Marching Through Georgia. Stephen Foster songs. Minstrels, which were extremely popular. And actually up to 1900 they were still very popular. It was slowly being superseded by vaudeville, but minstrels were still a very popular venue. And so, at home, you would have a machine, and the family would gather round and you'd listen. Usually you would have the kid get up and wind the machine as the adults sat. Very important. Or have them change the needles if it was a Victor machine. Of course, it was an Edison. They had to be very careful putting on the cylinder the right way. How many kids put cylinders on backwards on a mandrel and crack them? Happened a lot. You know, I've talked to lots of people over the years of what it was like surrounding themselves around the phonograph. It must have been quite an amazing thing to be sitting in your prairie home and listening to a waltz from Faust or the Blue Danube Waltz, or listening to Uncle Josh tell a Yankee dialect story, or various minstrel shows. Must have been fabulous entertainment. And one can imagine an older gentleman who had been a soldier during the Civil War, listening to the songs that he himself had sung all those many years before. Now, I was fortunate to interview a lot of people, a lot of notable people, as a matter of fact, and talk to them about the early days of recording as they recalled it. I always remember Walter Cronkite. I interviewed him at his offices at CBS. We had a wonderful conversation talking about so many different things. And, of course, I showed him a phonograph that I brought, which was a fireside phonograph. And he immediately recognized it. And he told me a little story which I thought was really, really interesting. He said, when I was a boy, he said, my grandparents had Edison machines. He said, my parents had Victor machines. He said, it didn't matter where I was the one who had to wind it. And I thought that was really interesting when you think about it. And when I did bring the machine with me and we made recordings of his voice, he said, let's have some Edison entertainment. And I put a recording of By the Light of the Silvery Moon, and we did a sing-along with the phonograph. Now, I thought about that maybe that's what happened a lot of times at home. They would put on the phonograph, and the gathering audience, which would be families and neighbors perhaps, would all sing along. I bet that happened. I remember that so well with Walter Cronkite, because when the music started, he started dancing around the room and stuff. It was an interesting thing to see. I remember talking with Gerald Ford, President Gerald Ford, about his experience with sound recording, after recording his voice on the phonograph. He told me about his childhood, how his father and he was adopted, by the way. His father owned a paint store. And he said it was pretty hard to get money together. He said his father worked very hard. He went down and helped at the paint store. And he said one day his father saved up enough money to buy a Victrola. And he said he remembered sitting there listening and playing records on that Victrola. And I always thought that kind of interesting when I brought an early phonograph, that I had little Jerry Ford sitting there listening to the recordings. And it was interesting because he said he had never talked about that at all. But he said it was such a difficult thing because money was so tight, and that his father was able to bring that phonograph home. You know, I can talk about countless people who no one knows about, who talked about the early days of the phonograph. I remember Miss Jennings, who I met many years ago in the 1970s, talking about sitting in the parlor and her father proudly bringing up the Edison phonograph and hooking it up, and they would listen to beautiful music. And it was such an exciting thing. Now, the fortunate thing is, of course, the sound that they heard was nothing like a real orchestra. But you have to remember that in the turn of the century, our imaginations were much more enhanced. And so when a record would play, we'd hear it and our imaginations would soar. Today, we don't listen to music with imagination. We don't think about the orchestra playing. We want to be entertained. And as soon as the recording is over, it's over. There's a few other things that come to mind. And as I have said before, that recording is a wonderful time machine. And it is interesting how people, over the years, have changed in their listening habits. It was looked upon with awe when it first came out. And by the time we get to the 1920s, it's somewhat of an understood art. And of course radio comes out, which pretty well kills the phonograph for a while. And then people did the same thing, further generations sitting around the radio. Of course, into the late 1940s, into the early 1950s, it changes once again to the television, where everyone would sit around or go to stores to look at it. And television shows would be so important. When I Love Lucy came out, stores would close. Establishments would close. No one dared do anything because the entire public was somewhere watching I Love Lucy. And so the phonograph at home, it's an interesting thing to think of. It must have been the most exciting thing in the world. It's just hard for us to understand it today, because our understanding of life and world and entertainment is so very different. But the phonograph, for the first time, afforded people to see past their little towns, or little worlds, or countries, and hear the sounds of great singers, great bands, great speakers, foreign songs of distant worlds. Really interesting. And so I figured I would just babble about this a little bit because I think it's kind of interesting when you think about it. Because sound recording is an amazing thing when it was developed. And in my view, it still is the most remarkable of all inventions which captures time, sound, and music. Thank you.